Hello, regards from Bari, Italy, from the city of St. Nicholas. I would rather talk about the story of his translation of his relics, rather than the topic of today's class. But that's not something we are expected to do in this particular class. So the theme of this class will be attitudes toward access powers in the Russian Church abroad, right? Russian Church abroad was naturally a conservative church, and the church consisted of people who were deeply traumatized by the events of the Civil War uh, and immigration. So, as I keep saying, people who became members of the Russian Church abroad, they didn't want to leave their homeland. At the same time, as consequences of the World War One, all European empires, and not quite European, since the Ottoman Empire consisted of European and Asian components, so the three empires collapsed. World changed drastically. It's kind of similar to things that we witness right now with all political changes, with new political elites replace the old political elites nowadays. And Russian refugees, they didn't have Russian passports anymore that they could use. They became stateless, and they wanted badly to continue the fight for the liberation of Russia from the communists. But European powers, they were reluctant about engaging in the open war with the Soviet Russia. And at the same time, many people were unhappy in Europe with political order that followed the World War One. As a result, right-wing conservative movements received enormous support, and a number of countries in Europe became fascists, like Hungary, Italy in the early 1920s, Romania, and a number of them was governed by fascist-style leaders, like Latvia, for instance, in the 1930s. So therefore, the whole ethos, the whole mood was in favor of nationalist, conservative attitude. I mean, there were many people who supported it. I'm not saying that it was overwhelmingly mood of this time. And with the rise to the power of Adolf Hitler in Germany, many Russians started to feel that here is the man. This is the man who will be able to confront Bolsheviks and who would be able to engage in crusade against Bolsheviks, and he will liberate Russia and will give it back to Russian refugees. But unfortunately, it was official propaganda, and people who were more prone to analyze, they not necessarily would have difficult time to read his Mein Kampf, his sort of quote-unquote gospel, where he was saying about his attitudes toward inferior, again in quotes, inferior nations. So, and to engage in something to support somebody who was so anti-human in sense of persecuting people of other kind, I think it was a terrible mistake. But it also gives us idea how people were myopic, how were they blind, because they expected to receive what was very, very important for them. And like somebody coined a maxim, there was saying, even with Satan, but against Bolsheviks. So that somehow captures the mindset of the members of Russian Church abroad. And members of the Paris jurisdiction, governed by Metropolitan Yevlogy, they were more, I think there were more, they were more complicated in their attitude somehow, because there were people who, France, of course, was an enemy of Germany, also that played a role. And also there were people who believe it's a mistake to fight against the communists in Russia with Nazis, because in fact it would support enslavement of the Russian land. But when Hitler came to the power in the early 1930s, he and his associates, they had a religious policy, and that religious policy would endorse only the single church, like from all denominations. And they decided to support the Russian Church abroad versus the Paris Exarchate in Germany, because it was conservative church, and it didn't have any affiliation with Masonic circles, because there were some Russians who were Masons, not like there was really conspiracy plot throughout the globe, anything like that, but they were part of Masonic lodges in France. And also because Paris Exarchate was French-based, and as I said, France was not a friend of Nazis Germany. So stateless Russians with the center in Serbia were much more appealing to the Nazis. As a result, the Russian Church abroad in Germany received the right of corporation that this church still enjoys until nowadays. And after the war, when all Nazis laws were assessed, this law wasn't found particularly Nazi, so this remained a valid law. Another thing that Russian Church used a building for church meeting, Russian Church abroad, I mean, that building was needed for the needs of the Nazis party. So the regime supported construction of a new church on Nachoderstrasse that is still there, and it was taken after the war in the divided Berlin by the Allies and transferred to Moscow Patriarchate. And this remained in Moscow Patriarchate, the Most Holy Mother of God Protection Cathedral until nowadays. But this was really astonishing for Russian refugees. While Orthodox Church was persecuted in Russia, while they were treated as refugees, as stateless, they received enormous support in Germany. So it's kind of understandable why they were excited about things like that. And Metropolitan Anastasi went to consecrate this cathedral from Belgrade, and unfortunately the address was already prepared and approved by the propaganda ministry, and that address had the words that people in Russia also looked with hope toward Hitler. And that sort of gives you an idea about reality check that Russian immigrants still needed all the time. All of us, I think, who don't live in Russia, kind of sometimes sometimes we lose the touch with reality. So therefore, words like that, they sound reasonable in the diaspora, but they were totally out of the place in Russia. And of course, it also would give a beautiful opportunity for the persecutors in the Soviet Union to exaggerate and to use those words as a pretext to persecute people in homeland, whoever they wanted. So because they really give them factual material. So in accusing their co-religionists in Russia in plotting against the regime, the Soviet regime, and this consecration took place in 1938. All right, and at that time, the Russian diocese in Germany was headed by an ethnic German from Ukraine, Serafim Lade, who became an Orthodox at the beginning of the 20th century, and he replaced a very inactive, very passive Archbishop Tikhon, who was a Russian refugee, who was an educated person, had theological education from the Imperial Russia, probably was from Russia, from the family of church. His ancestors probably served church for generations, but he was unable to act independently, more or less. And the Metropolitan Seraphim, being of German descent, he didn't have any inferior complex with Nazis. So, and of course he complied with the regime, but at the same time he not necessarily would do everything exactly as he was asked. And I think it was a blessing for Russian Church abroad to have such hierarchy, right? And when Poland was partitioned once again by Germany and the Soviet Union, 1939, the eastern territory of the Soviet Union of Poland were transferred under Moscow Patriarchate, and that actually for the first time when Moscow Patriarchate became a useful tool, because official policy in the Soviet Union was to destroy the church by 1940, so approximately like that. But now, having received many parishes in Poland, the regime decided that okay, so it's kind of we can extend their life for a little bit, because we cannot just start destroying churches in the newly acquired territories. So, and churches in the Western Poland were naturally transferred to the officially recognized Church of Germany. But Metropolitan Seraphim Lade, he refused to really get involved with this, and he kind of tried to support natural order of things there, because there was autonomous Polish autocephalous Polish church. So, and he kind of even supported the church. So he was sort of he acted very tactful. Okay. So majority of the flock of the Russian Church abroad, minus the UK and the US, found themselves in territories controlled by Axis. It was Central Europe, and you remember that the see of the Russian Church abroad was in Belgrade, and in 1940 Yugoslavia was taken over by Nazis. And Metropolitan Anastasi, he resided for a while in the British-controlled Palestine. So because it was part of the Ottoman Empire, and in after losing the war, right, in 1919, it was transferred, or probably maybe 1919 after Pact of Versailles, it was transferred to the Brits, and Brits, they were in temporary control of Palestine. So he was an Anglophile, and that also preserved him from making an embarrassing statement, as some other hierarchs, like Seraphim of Paris, did, basically calling Russians to join the Nazis' army and fight against Bolsheviks and join crusade. And then after the war, he was pressed to change his attitude toward 190-degree, join Moscow Patriarchate, and that's all gives me idea that talk is cheap. So therefore, I don't really buy any polemical talk nowadays, because kind of we saw the thing that all hierarchs of the Russian Church abroad who found themselves near Moscow Patriarchate, they accepted Moscow Patriarchate with no exception after the war. And in this situation, so Poland was partitioned, and most of Russians were under regimes of Nazis allies, under Axis regimes. There was a dilemma for Russians. What should they do? Should they just join the only game in town and go with Nazis to fight against the Bolsheviks, because for many it was like continuation of the civil war, or should they abstain, right? So in Yugoslavia there was a huge enthusiasm within the Russian community. Russian clergy started to petition Metropolitan Anastasi to be sent to Russia, to go there. But Nazis, they also had different vision. They didn't want Russian emigres to go to Russia and proselytize, basically, to start converting people, to start making them Russian monarchists, so a Russian patriot. And they did it very how to say successfully after the war, because many people were transferred forcefully from their places to Germany to work as a workforce, and they didn't want to come back to the Soviet Union. And that's when this fusion happened, that all the immigrants met new immigrants from the Soviet Union. Some family were founded, and some people, they joined Russian Church Abroad, and they subscribed to Russian Church Abroad ideology, a sort of conservative Russian nationalist, patriotic message. And that's what I wanted to say about Europe, right? So, but some of them, some Russian immigrants, they would find their way to the occupied territories in Russia, as for instance Rostislav Vladimirovich Polchaninov, who is still around, an active member of St. Seraphim congregation in Siklev, and he went from Yugoslavia to set up scout movement in Baltic states, right? So and also to help people with to get rid of communist propaganda in their heads and so on. So there were some people who were in German army, like for instance doctors. So there also was a big contingent of people, of Germans whose ancestors were for generations in Russian, and some of them, like Rosenberg, they were very famous with Nazis, and some of them they became clergymen of the Russian Church Abroad, like just to mention Grabe, or to mention Father Alexander Schmemann, or to mention Father John Meindorf. So this is their ancestors. They were from Europe, from Germany, and they of course became Russian, famous Russian churchmen. Another significant area of impact was China. And China, Manchuria, huge parts of China, in particular case Manchuria, that was populated by many Russians, and Russians, they were in charge of the railway there in with the capital Harbin. So Harbin was occupied by Japanese, and Japanese supported particular Russian groups. They wanted Russian immigration to be pro-Japanese, and they kind of set up the same model as was in Germany, that some Russians would write reports about other Russians to the Japanese, and then probably the same people would write reports to Americans and to Babao. So I don't think Russian immigration really should to be very much idealized. There were a lot of decent people who wanted, who were ready to sacrifice their lives for the white cause and for restoration of just order of things, political things in Russia. But also humans are humans everywhere, so there were people who would just opportunists, which is also understandable. And Japanese, they proposed that all subjects of the country, all subjects of their empire in 1943, marked anniversary of Japanese goddess Amaterasu. And there was discussions among Russians. It was really unbelievably similar to what happened with early Christians. So there was discussions with Russians whether they should participate in that. And some people said that basically Shintoists, they don't really have idea of goddess, and it's sort of like more like ideology. It's not really a personified cult. So just okay to participate, it's nothing wrong. So if you read it in a certain way. So, but Russian hierarchs, they were quite unanimously against this, opposed it. I don't think any hierarch really participated in events or paid any duties any to this goddess. So, but it's interesting. This needs to be studied more. Right. So again, Russians found themselves in the Soviet-occupied Manchuria after the war, in the same way as in Central Europe. Many people were taking, even as they never were Soviet citizens, they were taking to the Soviet Union. Some of them just were settled there, and a number of them suffered in prisons and concentration camps. So, and that's what happened all over the Soviet-occupied Europe and the Soviet-occupied Europe and in China. Okay, so I don't have much to offer you for as of readings for this week. Watch this short, not short. Watch the video with Елена Васильевна Перекрестов from San Francisco, who is very enthusiastic about Alexander Shmarel. He was technically a member of the Russian Church abroad, because I mean he wasn't really, how to say, church active. But his letters were, I mean, church active as like he was a Christian, he was a member of congregation, but I don't know to what extent, how often he did attend parish, and so. But it doesn't really matter, because his ethos is very, very strongly Christian, and basically I converted sort of in my face regarding in him. So I really sort of, I mean, he bought me when I read his letters a while ago. And since my wife, she studied in Munich and was active in the church in Munich, she was a member of parish council there of the Russian Church abroad. We decided also, and I've been connected with the Russian Church in Munich for a long time. So we decided to name our youngest child Alexander after Alexander of Munich. But I would not use him as a model for Russian Church abroad members. I think he's an exception, because he was anti-Nazis, but he was bicultural. He was strongly German. He fought on the Eastern Front, and then he supported Germans who wanted the change of the regime. So he was kind of like a hyphenated Americans, like Russian Americans, and so. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. Any feedback is appreciated. So anything that would make me improve it, if I can afford it, of course, time-wise, and so. I will really, really appreciate to hear from you. So, and I hope you enjoy your summer, and I will talk to you next time. Bye-bye.